The night was quiet, almost too quiet, when Jake Morrison arrived at the old lakefront house for the very first time. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and wet stone. Moonlight shimmered across the still water, and in the distance, the silhouette of a bridge stretched out over the lake like the arm of a forgotten giant dot. It was not just any bridge. It was the Morrison Bridge built in 1923 by his great-grandfather. Samuel Morrison. Jake stood at the edge of the driveway, suitcase in one hand, keys in the other, and stared at the stone arch that connected one part of the property to the next. The bridge looked old, weather-worn, but still proud. It carried with it stories from the past, whispers from another century. He had inherited this place, not just the house, not just the land, but everything tied to it, including secrets he did not yet understand. When his uncle passed away, Jake received a thick envelope from the family lawyer. Inside was a deed, a set of yellowed documents, and one note written in shaky handwriting: "Protect the bridge. Protect the water. It is your birthright." Jake didn't know what that meant. He was a civil engineer, not a historian. He worked on modern buildings, steel beams, and concrete highways. But something about those words felt heavier than any structure he had ever built. The bridge stood like a sentinel in the moonlight, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He did not yet know that this bridge would pull him into the greatest fight of his life, a fight not just for property, but for history, law, and truth. The next morning, he walked the property. Birds filled the air with song, and the lake sparkled under the rising sun. Children from nearby houses played on the opposite shore, their laughter echoing. It felt peaceful until a woman's voice shattered the calm. "Excuse me." Jake turned. A tall, sharp-faced woman in a tailored blazer marched toward him, a clipboard in her hand. Her steps were fast, precise, like every second she spent here was a second wasted. "I'm Linda Prescott," she said, barely giving Jake time to nod. "President of the Homeowners Association. You must be the new Morrison." Jake offered a polite smile. "That's right, just settling in." Linda's eyes swept past him and landed on the bridge. Her lips curled with distaste. "Yes, well, we need to talk about that eyesore," she said, pointing at the stone arch. "It violates architectural standards for the community. We'll need you to remove it." Jake blinked, unsure if he heard. "Correctly remove it. That bridge has been here for 100 years. Linda raised her clipboard. 100 years of being non-compliant. The HOA has voted. It needs to go. You'll receive formal notice soon." And just like that, she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the pavement, leaving Jake frozen in disbelief. He looked back at the bridge, his family's bridge, and felt a storm rising in his chest. Something told him this was only the beginning. Jake didn't sleep much that night. He kept pacing near the window, staring at the bridge under the pale glow of the moon. His great-grandfather built it with his bare hands and stone pulled from the hills. And now, within just one day of moving in, someone wanted it gone by morning. The conflict had arrived in writing. A crisp envelope slid under Jake's front door. The letterhead read, "Lakewood Community Homeowners Association." The message was short and sharp. Notice of violation. Structure identified as Morrison Bridge is not in compliance with Lakewood HOA architectural standards. Owner is hereby ordered to remove or demolish the structure within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per week and further legal action. Jake read the letter twice, then a third time. He almost laughed. A bridge that had stood for a century long before the HOA even existed was now being labeled illegal. Still, laughter faded quickly. HOA boards had power. They could make life miserable. By afternoon, Jake saw Linda Prescott again. This time she wasn't alone. Two men in black polo shirts with Prescott security stitched on their chests stood behind her. They looked more like bodyguards than neighborhood watch. Linda crossed her arms. "Mr. Morrison, I trust. You received our notice." Jake held the paper in his hand. "I did, and with all due respect, you're wrong. This bridge has been here since 1923. It's not some shed I built last week." Linda smirked. "Rules are rules. Our community has standards. That bridge doesn't match our design code. It's dangerous, too. Liability nightmare." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "I'm a civil engineer. I can assure you that bridge is solid. Safer than most of the roads around here." One of the security men stepped forward, voice flat. "Best to listen to Mrs. Prescott. HOA has authority." "Here." Jake looked from the guard to Linda, then back at the bridge. Something inside him hardened. "You don't understand," Jake said slowly. "This isn't just stone and mortar. This bridge is my family's history. My great-grandfather built it before your HOA even existed. You don't get to erase that." Linda's eyes narrowed, her tone icy. "We'll see what the court says about that." The harassment begins the next week felt like a siege. Daily fines began piling up. Every morning, Jake found another notice taped to his door. HOA inspectors trespassed onto his land, snapping photos of the bridge. Neighbors whispered, some avoiding him, others apologizing quietly when Linda wasn't around. And then came the false complaints. First, Linda accused him of storing hazardous materials near the bridge. Then she claimed he had hosted an unauthorized event at the lake. None of it was true, but each claim forced Jake to respond, wasting hours with paperwork and hearings. It was harassment, plain and simple. One evening, as he stood by the lake, Jake thought about selling the property and walking away. Life was easier before this place. But then he remembered his uncle's letter. "Protect the bridge. Protect the water. It is your birthright." Birthright. The word echoed in his mind. Why had his uncle written that? Why not simply say, "Take care of the bridge"? Something was hidden here. Something Linda didn't know or maybe feared. That night, Jake dug into the dusty box of old documents left with the deed. Most were yellowed maps, survey notes, and hand-scribbled ledgers. But then he found it, a thick folded paper, stamped. In fading ink, 1923, Secondary Water Rights Agreement. Jake's hands trembled as he read. The document gave Samuel Morrison and his heirs permanent, transferable rights to manage the water flow of Lakewood through the dam connected to the bridge. In other words, Jake didn't just inherit the bridge. He inherited control of the water itself. And now he understood why his uncle called it a birthright. This wasn't just family history. This was power, and Linda Prescott had no idea what she had just started. The discovery of the water rights document gave Jake a new kind of confidence, but he wasn't ready to show his cards yet. For now, he kept the papers locked inside a fireproof safe in his living room. Linda Prescott, however, was far from slowing down. If anything, her campaign against Jake grew more aggressive. The HOA's pressure. Within 2 weeks, Jake had received $3,000 in fines for non-compliance, 3 violation notices accusing him of ignoring HOA rules, a warning that if he didn't cooperate, his access to community facilities, including the lake, would be suspended. Jake laughed bitterly at that last one. The HOA thought they controlled the lake. They didn't know the truth yet. Every morning, Jake's mailbox was stuffed with letters. Some were from the HOA, some were anonymous, filled with insults and even threats. Take down your ugly bridge before someone gets hurt. You don't belong here. Sell your property and leave. Jake suspected Linda was behind it all, but proving it was another matter. Security, intimidation. One Saturday night, Jake returned home from the grocery store to find a black SUV parked outside his gate. Inside were two men from Prescott Security. Evening. Mr. Morrison, one of them said, voice flat and cold. We're here to do a routine check. Jake frowned. Check for what? Community safety, the man replied, though his hand rested on his belt like he was armed. Jake knew enough about private security law to realize what was happening. These weren't friendly guards. They were Linda's enforcers, trying to intimidate him. You're trespassing, Jake said firmly. This is private property. Leave. The guard smirked. HOA rules give us authority. Jake stepped closer, eyes locked on the man. HOA rules don't override state law. And unless you want to explain this to the sheriff, you'll get off my land, now. For a moment, silence. Then the SUV engine roared, and the men drove off. Jake watched their taillights vanish into the night. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. The court papers. A week later, the knock came. A uniformed courier handed Jake a thick envelope. HOAV. Morrison, petition for injunction. Linda had officially filed in county court to force the removal of the bridge. Jake sat at his kitchen table, reading every line. His pulse quickened. But not from fear. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The HOA's petition claimed the bridge was unsafe. The bridge blocked aesthetic harmony. The bridge was a public hazard due to potential flooding. Jake almost laughed at the last one. The irony was perfect. Because according to his great-grandfather's documents, he not the HOA controlled flood prevention through the dam, but before making a move, Jake called someone he trusted. Enter the lawyer. Sounds like they picked the wrong guy to mess with, said Daniel Rivera, Jake's longtime friend and a property rights attorney. They met at Jake's kitchen table that evening. Daniel flipped through the old water rights papers, whistling under his breath. This, he said, tapping the document, is gold. Federal law protects these rights. They predate the HOA by decades. They don't have a case. Jake leaned back, a smile tugging at his lips for the first time in weeks. So what's the play? Daniel grinned. First, we file for an emergency injunction to freeze their case. Then, we countersue for harassment, trespassing, and abuse of authority. Oh, and when the time's right, we revealed this. He held up the water rights. Paper like a sword. Jake felt the tide turning. Linda strikes harder, but Linda wasn't done. The very next day, a police cruiser pulled into Jake's driveway. An officer stepped out, looking uneasy. Mr. Morrison, he said, we've had reports of illegal dumping near your bridge. Neighbors claim you're storing toxic chemicals. Jake's jaw dropped. That's ridiculous. I don't even use chemicals. Sure enough, when they walked down to the bridge, 3 barrels sat near the water's edge. Their sides were painted with bright orange warning symbols. Jake froze. Those barrels weren't his. The officer frowned. This is serious, Mr. Morrison. Jake realized immediately what had happened. Someone planted them there. and he didn't have to guess who. Linda Prescott had just taken the fight to a dangerous new level. Jake stood by the lake long after the officer left, staring at the 3 barrels glowing orange under the setting sun. The officer had promised to send an environmental team to test them, but Jake already knew the truth. Those barrels weren't his. They were planted. Linda Prescott was no longer just harassing him, she was trying to frame him for a crime. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't about a bridge anymore. It was about power. And if Linda thought intimidation would break him, she had underestimated him. Into the archives the next morning, Jake spread the old family documents across his living room floor. Maps, surveys, deeds, water, records, sole, handwritten, faded, but still legible. Most people would have seen a pile of dusty junk, but Jake was a civil engineer. He knew how to read blueprints, diagrams, and old land surveys. One map, dated 1923, caught his eye. It showed not only the bridge, but also a dam structure on the far side of the lake. His great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, had sketched it in careful ink, with notes about flow rates, water storage, and floodgates. Jake traced the lines with his finger. "This isn't just a bridge," he whispered. "It's part of a water management system." His uncle's letter made sense now. Protect the bridge, protect the water. The two were connected. The water rights document. Jake pulled the thick paper from its envelope again. Secondary Water Rights Agreement 1923. The language was old-fashioned. But Daniel, his lawyer friend, had already explained the essentials. The Morrison family had permanent rights to regulate water levels through the dam. These rights were recorded at the federal level, meaning no local authority, not even the county, let alone the HOA, could override them. The water rights were attached to the land itself, not to a person. That meant as long as Jake owned the property, those rights belonged to him. Jake leaned back, a smile creeping across his face. Linda Prescott thought she was untouchable, but he had a weapon more powerful than her security thugs or HOA fines. He had the law. Testing the system the next weekend, Jake hiked across the property to find the old dam. It was hidden behind a grove of pines, covered in moss and vines. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but as Jake climbed down the stone steps, he found the old iron floodgate mechanism still intact. Rusty, but intact. He put his hand on the wheel. It was stiff, but with effort it turned. Slowly, the gate creaked open and water gushed through the channel. Jake laughed out loud. It still worked. He quickly closed it again, careful not to change the lake level too much. But the message was clear. He controlled the water, not the HOA. Gathering evidence back at the house, Jake scanned every document and saved digital copies. He also photographed the dam and bridge from every angle. He knew Linda would try to twist the truth, so he needed proof, undeniable proof. Daniel, his lawyer, was thrilled. "This is better than I hoped," Daniel said over the phone. "We'll file the injunction next week. Once the judge sees these documents, the HOA doesn't stand a chance." Jake exhaled in relief. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he was winning. Linda's desperation, but Linda sensed she was losing control. The very next day, Jake woke to the sound of engines outside. When he opened the door, he saw construction equipment parked near the lake, bulldozers, cement mixers, and workers in hard hats. Linda herself stood at the shoreline, directing them. Jake stormed down. "What the hell is this?" Linda smiled, sweetly. "Oh, just some community improvements." We're expanding the walking path around the lake. It'll pass right through this area. Bridge or no bridge. Jake's eyes narrowed. You're building on my land. She tilted her head. That's funny. According to our revised community maps, this part belongs to the association. Jake felt his blood boil. She was falsifying boundaries now, but he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. Instead, he pulled out his phone, snapped photos, and said calmly, "Thank you, Linda. You just gave me more evidence. For the first time." Her smile faltered. Jake now had proof of trespassing, attempted land theft, and planted evidence. Combined with the water rights, he had a case strong enough to do more than defend himself. He could take Linda and her entire HOA board down, and soon he would. The lake was calm, but the community around it was boiling. Every week, the conflict between Jake and the HOA grew louder, nastier, and more public. For Jake, it felt like he was living in the middle of a siege. For Linda, it was a battle she refused to lose. The smear campaign, it started with whispers. Neighbors, who once waved at Jake, now avoided eye contact. A few even crossed the street when they saw him. Then came the newsletter. The HOA circulated a monthly community bulletin. Linda made sure Jake was the headline. Uncooperative homeowner jeopardizes safety of lake community despite repeated requests from the board. Mr. Jake Morrison refuses to comply with safety standards. The Morrison Bridge is unstable and poses a flooding risk. The HOA urges all residents to demand action before tragedy strikes. Jake slammed the paper down on his table. Not a word of it was true. But lies, once printed, spread faster than truth. Within days, angry residents showed up at his gate. Some yelled at him to tear down the bridge. Others accused him of risking their children's safety. A few muttered curses and walked off. Linda had turned the community against him. The false police reports 2 weeks later. A sheriff's deputy knocked on Jake's door. Double quotes, "Mr. Morrison, we've had reports of loud parties here at night," the deputy said. Jake blinked. "Parties? I live alone. There's no music, no noise." The deputy shrugged. "We have to check every complaint." 3 nights later, another deputy came. This time, the report claimed Jake was illegally storing firearms. Jake showed the deputy his empty garage. Nothing. But the message was clear. Linda was using police reports as another weapon. Even if they found nothing, the repeated visits painted Jake as a problem. Strained nerves, Daniel. His lawyer urged him to stay calm. "They want you to explode," Daniel said over the phone. "If you snap, they'll use it against you. Don't give them what they want." But it was easier said than done. Jake barely slept. He felt watched, followed. Prescott's security trucks cruised slowly past his property at night, headlights off. Engines rumbling like predators circling their prey. Every time Jake looked at the bridge, he felt the weight of history pressing down. His great-grandfather had built it with pride. Would he be the Morrison who failed to protect it? Preparing the case one evening, Daniel arrived with a stack of files. "Good news," he said, dropping them on the table. "We filed the emergency injunction. That freezes their lawsuit until the federal water rights are reviewed." Jake exhaled. Finally, a small victory. Daniel tapped another folder. "And here's better news. We've started digging into the HOA's financials." Jake raised an eyebrow, and Daniel's smile was sharp. "And Linda's cooking the books. Missing funds, fake invoices, payments to her husband's security company. It's all there. We just need more proof." Jake felt hope stir. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. This was about exposing Linda for what she really was. Linda pushes to father. Next blow came in broad daylight. Jake was driving back from town when flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. A police cruiser pulled him over. "Mr. Morrison," the officer said, "step out of the vehicle." Jake obeyed, confused. "What's this about?" "Your license plate was reported stolen." Jake froze. Reported stolen. It was his plate, registered to his name. The officer checked, made a call, and frowned. Finally, he sighed. "Looks like a mistake, but you should get this sorted at the DMV." Jake drove off, anger boiling. He didn't need to guess who filed that false report. Linda Prescott was no longer playing a game. She was trying to break him. A spark of strategy that night, as Jake sat on his porch, staring at the bridge. Daniel called. "I've been thinking," Daniel said. "You've got something Linda doesn't control of the water. If you wanted to, you could drop the lake, level by 2 feet tomorrow. Imagine what that would do to the resort's docks, to their summer business." Jake hesitated. "You're saying, use the dam as leverage?" "Exactly," Daniel said. "It's not revenge, it's negotiation. They want to destroy you. You need to show them you're not just defending, you're holding the cards." Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked at the moonlight dancing across the water. For weeks, Linda Prescott had painted him as powerless. But soon, she and everyone else would see the truth. The Morrison family didn't just build a bridge, they built control over the entire lake, and now Jake was ready to use it. For weeks, Jake had been playing defense. Now, with Daniel's guidance and the weight of his great-grandfather's documents, it was time to strike back, filing the injunction on Monday morning. Daniel walked into the county courthouse carrying a thick binder of evidence. Jake went with him, documents in hand. The filing clerk barely glanced up until Daniel placed the binder on the counter. Emergency injunction, federal water rights. Those words changed everything. The clerk's eyes widened, and within hours, a federal judge signed an order. All HOA actions against Jake were frozen until the water rights dispute could be resolved. Jake left the courthouse with a copy of the order in his pocket. For the first time, he wasn't just defending, he was winning, exposing the financial trail that evening. Daniel laid out what he and his paralegal had uncovered. Linda's been funneling HOA money into her husband's company, Prescott Security, Daniel explained. No bids, no contracts, just checks, written straight to him. And it doesn't stop there. We found invoices for construction projects that never happened, repairs billed twice, funds lost in accounting errors. Jake's eyes narrowed. So she's been robbing the community blind. Exactly. Once we get residents on our side, they'll turn against her. But first, we need leverage. Jake knew what leverage meant. The dam, the first move that weekend, before dawn, Jake hiked down to the old iron floodgate. The lake shimmered under the morning light, calm and quiet. He gripped the wheel, heart pounding. Slowly, he turned it. The gate groaned, water rushing. Through the channel, Jake watched the lake level begin to drop inch by inch. By evening, docks at the resort stood partly above water. Small boats tilted awkwardly, their hulls scraping mud. Tourists grumbled as fishing was cancelled for unfavorable conditions. Jake stood on his porch, watching the chaos unfold. He hadn't drained much, just enough to send a message, and the message was clear. He controlled the water, not Linda, not the HOA. The panic by Monday, the HOA was in uproar. Residents complained about low water levels. Resort guests demanded refunds. The board called an emergency meeting. Linda stormed into Jake's driveway with 2 board members at her side. "What did you do?" she screamed, her face red with fury. Jake leaned against his porch rail, calm. "I exercised my rights. You can't tamper with community property," she shouted. Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it out. "Federal Water Rights Act, 1923. My family controls the dam. The lake is not HOA property. It never was." Linda froze. Her board members exchanged nervous glances. Jake smiled faintly. "If you want the lake back, maybe try negotiating instead of bullying." For the first time, Linda had no immediate answer. Media attention. The story spread faster than Jake expected. A local journalist, tipped off by a disgruntled resident, called him for an interview. Within a week, the headline hit the news. Homeowner claims historic water rights over Lakewood Resort. Cameras showed Jake standing proudly on the Morrison Bridge, holding his great-grandfather's documents. Neighbors who once avoided him now stopped to ask questions. Some quietly admitted they never trusted Linda. Others said they'd suspected the HOA of corruption for years but were too scared to speak up. Jake realized something important. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a community fight. Linda strikes back, but Linda wasn't finished. 2 nights later, Jake woke to the sound of shattering glass. He rushed to his living room to find a brick on the floor and his front window broken. Attached to the brick was a note: "Stop messing with the lake, or else." Jake gripped the note tightly, rage flooding through him. He knew Linda hadn't thrown the brick herself, but her thugs had. The line had been crossed. He picked up his phone, dialed Daniel, and said in a steady voice, "It's time. Let's take this to federal court." Jake's life had become a delicate balance between engineering, law, and survival. Each day brought new harassment, new threats, and new challenges, but also new opportunities to uncover the truth. With Daniel's guidance, Jake decided it was time to dig deeper into Linda Prescott and the HOA. Following the paper trail Daniel had already hinted at financial misconduct. Now, Jake and Daniel worked like detectives. They combed through HOA budgets from the last 10 years contracts with Prescott Security Building, permits, and invoices bank. Statements and suspicious payments. The evidence was staggering. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into Prescott's security accounts, with no documented work. Multiple invoices for community improvements had been double billed. Funds meant for lake maintenance and bridge safety were missing. Jake's heart pounded. Linda had not just tried to intimidate him, she had betrayed the entire community. Secret construction projects. Jake also discovered that Linda had approved construction on public land that encroached on his property. Survey maps had been falsified to make it appear that the HOA owned areas near the bridge and dam. The evidence was clear. She had been stealing land and funds for years. Jake photographed everything, marking locations and dates. Every note, every signature, every map would later serve as proof in court. The community turns word began to spread. Residents, once loyal to Linda, started asking questions. Why was money missing from the HOA account? Why were the construction projects never finished? Why had they been told Jake was the problem when he simply wanted to protect his family's property? Neighbors approached Jake quietly, offering support, tips, and even footage from security cameras they had installed. Jake realized something crucial. The community was his ally. He didn't need to fight alone anymore. Linda sensed the tide turning. She tried to tighten her grip, calling emergency board meetings and issuing more fines. She even threatened to sue Jake personally for defamation after he began sharing public documents exposing her schemes. But Jake was ready. Each threat only strengthened his resolve. He filed counterclaims for harassment, trespassing, falsifying documents, legal land encroachment. The legal net was tightening around Linda, leveraging the water. Meanwhile, Jake continued to exercise control. Over the lake, he adjusted water levels carefully, enough to send a message without causing real damage. The resort's operations were disrupted. Docks were partially dry, boats were stuck, and managers began calling Linda with urgent complaints. At the next HOA meeting, Linda tried to play confident, but residents whispered, fumed, and questioned her leadership. Jake could feel the balance of power shifting. Evidence of security. Misconduct. One final discovery cemented Linda's vulnerability. Footage from the neighborhood cameras revealed Prescott. Security guards trespassing on Jake's property, attempts to intimidate him at night, workers planting false evidence near the bridge. This was proof not just of harassment, but of a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the HOA president. Daniel grinned as he reviewed the footage. We have enough to file federal charges for intimidation and fraud. Jake leaned back, staring at the bridge. His great-grandfather had built this bridge to withstand storms, floods, and the passage of time. Now it would withstand corruption and greed. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the golden sunlight as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath the surface, Jake held a secret power, a weapon no HOA president, no board, and no resort manager could touch. Control of the water itself. Planning the move, Jake and Daniel reviewed the water rights documents again. The federal designation was clear. Jake had the authority to regulate the lake's flow. Any attempt by the HOA or resort to interfere was a direct violation of federal law. Adjusting water levels strategically could create pressure without causing irreversible damage. Jake knew exactly what he had to do. It's time to force negotiations, he said. Not with threats, not with lawsuits, with leverage. Daniel nodded. Use the water. The lake will speak for itself. The first strategic adjustment that night. Under the cover of darkness, Jake walked to the dam. The iron floodgate groaned as he turned the wheel, slowing the inflow to the lake. By morning, docks at the resort were partially dry. Boats were stuck or tipping. Guests complained, and resort operations were disrupted. Linda Prescott and the HOA board scrambled. Phones rang non-stop. Staff demanded answers. Jake stood on the Morrison Bridge, watching the chaos unfold. He didn't gloat. He adjusted the flow just enough to send a message. He was in control now. Resort panicked. The resort managers arrived at the HOA office demanding explanations. What's going on with the lake? They asked. Frustrated, Linda floundered, trying to blame engineers, weather, or maintenance issues. But the truth was unstoppable. Jake's water rights were real, enforceable, and now being exercised. The resort began to calculate losses. Dock repairs, lost bookings, angry guests, saw mounting daily. The negotiation table. Linda, for the first time, knew she was in trouble. Jake sent a formal letter through Daniel. Subject, negotiation request pursued. 2 federal water rights, inherited from Samuel Morrison. I have adjusted lake levels to ensure public safety and lake management compliance. I am available to meet for negotiations regarding future use of the lake and bridge. Failure to cooperate will result in continued enforcement of these rights. For days, Linda refused to respond, but the resort couldn't afford more disruption. Finally, the board agreed to meet. Jake arrived at the table confident, calm, and prepared. He laid out water rights document stamp, maps and engineering plans, evidence of HOA financial misconduct, proof of harassment and trespassing. Linda had no rebuttal. The room was silent. The turning point, Jake's calm authority, contrasted sharply with Linda's panic. Board members shifted in their chairs, realizing they had been backing the wrong person. Residents, now watching closely, began whispering about holding Linda accountable. The leverage was undeniable. Jake controlled the water. He had the law, and he had the truth. Negotiations began. The HOA agreed to cease harassment of Jake, recognize the Morrison Bridge as historic, provide transparency on HOA finances, collaborate on lake management. Moving forward, the water had spoken. A lesson in strategy. Jake realized something profound. Power wasn't just about money, influence, or intimidation. True power was knowledge, legal authority, and smart strategy. The Morrison Bridge was safe. The lake was under responsible management. Linda Prescott had no choice but to negotiate and comply. For the first time in months, Jake smiled, watching the sunset over the lake. The battle wasn't fully over, but for now, the tide had turned. The lake sparkled under the morning sun, but the calm surface hid the storm brewing in courtrooms, newsrooms, and community halls. Jake had shifted from defense to offense. But now, the conflict reached a new level: federal courts, media scrutiny, and the divided community. Federal court interventional. Linda Prescott, unwilling to lose control, escalated the fight by filing emergency motions in the county court, claiming that Jake's manipulation of the lake was dangerous and unlawful. Daniel, prepared as always, moved swiftly. County courts have no jurisdiction here, he explained. Federal water rights supersede local HOA regulations. Will file an immediate federal response. Within days, the case landed in federal court. The judge reviewed Jake's documents. Water rights deeds from 1923, dam, engineering plans, evidence of HOA harassment and fraud. The court granted Jake's injunction, halting all HOA actions and reaffirming his authority over the dam and lake. For Jake, this was more than a legal win. It was validation. The law was on his side. Media scrutiny. News of the federal case spread quickly. Reporters arrived at Lakewood, cameras rolling, questions flying. Historic bridge owner battles HOA over lake control. Local channels interviewed Jake on the Morrison Bridge. He spoke calmly, explaining his family's century-old rights and the importance of preserving history and water management. Residents watched the coverage with mixed reactions. Some finally saw Linda's deception. Others feared conflict in their neighborhood. Community division. The media attention divided the community. Some residents rallied behind Jake, inspired by his courage and knowledge. Others remained loyal to Linda, upset about fines, lake adjustments, or simply afraid of confrontation. Small disputes erupted between neighbors, fueled by rumor and mistrust. Jake realized that winning the legal battle wasn't enough. He needed to heal the community. Linda's last attempts. Linda, desperate, tried one final tactic. She called for emergency HOA votes, demanding Jake be removed from any community committees. She hired private investigators to dig into his personal life, hoping to find dirt. She sent threatening letters to residents, warning them about the dangers of Morrison's water experiments. Each attempt failed. Jake had the documents, the law, and an emerging network of residents backing him. Even the resort managers, frustrated by disruptions, began quietly supporting Jake. Jake's strategic response. Jake used patience and transparency to win the battle of perception. Public updates. He shared his research on the bridge, the dam, and water management in local newsletters and meetings. Evidence distribution. He provided residents with proof of Linda's financial misconduct and harassment. Community engagement. Jake invited neighbors to see the dam, the bridge, and the flow control system, explaining everything in simple terms. Slowly, the community began to unite around Jake's leadership. A glimpse of victory by the time the federal judge scheduled the next hearing. The landscape had changed. Residents openly supported Jake in court. Media coverage highlighted his historical preservation and legal rights. The HOA board, previously silent under Linda's control, wavered. Jake finally understood a truth his great-grandfather seemed to have known. History, knowledge, and integrity were more powerful than intimidation, lies, or threats. The battle was reaching its peak. The turning point had arrived. The tension in Lakewood had reached a fever pitch. For months, the battle had been legal, strategic, and psychological. Now it was time for the final confrontation. Federal court day. Jake arrived at the federal courthouse early, documents in hand, heart steady. The courtroom was packed. Residents, reporters, HOA members, and lawyers. Linda Prescott entered with an air of forced confidence, her board members behind her. But Jake noticed her eyes flickered nervously at the stacks of evidence Daniel had prepared. The judge called the case. Daniel stepped forward, calm and precise. He presented the 1923 water rights, deed engineering, plans of the dam and bridge, photos and videos of HOA harassment and trespassing. Financial misconduct evidence. Every point hit hard. The judge's brow furrowed as the scope of Linda's actions became clear, exposing the truth. Daniel's cross-examination revealed Linda's misdeeds. She had funneled HOA funds into her husband's company, Prescott. Security personnel had illegally trespassed on private property. False complaints and planted evidence had been used to intimidate Jake. Construction projects were fraudulently billed. Encroaching on Morrison property, the courtroom murmured in disbelief. Residents who once supported her now whispered in shock. Jake, seated quietly, let Daniel do the talking. He didn't need to shout. Truth had a louder voice than fear or deception. Community reaction outside the courthouse. Residents gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. Did you see the evidence? One said. She lied about everything. My parents warned me about her years ago. Another whispered. The tide had fully turned. The community now understood Jake wasn't the enemy, Linda Prescott was. The water rights triumph. The judge paused, reviewing the 1923 deeds and federal regulations. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, your family's water rights predate any HOA regulations. You have full legal authority over the dam and lake management. Linda's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The judge continued. Furthermore, evidence shows deliberate harassment, financial misconduct, and illegal actions by the HOA board. Appropriate penalties will follow, and the Morrison Bridge is to remain intact as a historic structure. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jake exhaled. Victory at last. Linda's fall with federal backing and overwhelming evidence, Linda Prescott had no choice but to resign. Board members who had supported her quietly stepped aside. The HOA faced fines, investigations, and a restructuring under resident oversight. Jake.com and composed, watched as Linda was escorted out, her plans crumbling around her, restoring the community. Jake didn't gloat. Instead, he reached out to neighbors and residents. He explained the water management system, showing everyone how the dam worked. He shared plans for maintaining the historic bridge and surrounding areas. He encouraged community participation in decisions about the lake. The result, trust rebuilt, collaboration, strengthened, residents united to preserve history, environment, and property rights. A historic legacy preserved. The Morrison Bridge, once threatened, became a symbol of resilience and heritage. Tourists and locals alike admired its sturdy stones and century-old craftsmanship. The lake thrived under careful management, blending natural beauty with responsible stewardship. Jake reflected on the long journey. The fight had been exhausting, terrifying, and complex, but with knowledge, strategy, and integrity he had preserved his family legacy and strengthened the community. As the sun set over the lake, the bridge cast a long, proud shadow across the water, an enduring reminder that history, law, and courage could overcome even the most ruthless adversaries. Legal reforms and the Morrison Act. Following Jake's victory, lawmakers took notice. The case had revealed how HOA overreach could endanger property rights and community well-being. Inspired by the Morrison family's century-old dedication, the state enacted the Morrison Act, which protected historic water rights from local interference, limited HOA powers in property and environmental management, tried full transparency in HOA finances and decision-making. Jake watched the bill pass with a quiet sense of pride. His great-grandfather's foresight had indirectly changed the law. For generations to come, community healing. Lakewood's residents gradually healed from the months of division. Former skeptics began to trust. Jake and other proactive members of the HOA. Community meetings shifted from conflict to collaboration. The lake became a shared resource, maintained with clear rules and respect for the environment. Parents brought their children to the Morrison Bridge, telling stories of resilience, history, and courage. Preserving history. Jake initiated a project to restore and protect the historic bridge. Local craftsmen repaired worn stones. Informational plaques detailed its history and engineering significance. Visitors came from across the state to admire the structure, making it a heritage tourism landmark. The bridge became more than a family legacy. It became a symbol of justice, knowledge, and perseverance. Personal reflection. One quiet evening, Jake stood on the bridge, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The water glimmered, calm and serene. He thought of Samuel Morrison, his great-grandfather, whose meticulous engineering and legal foresight had made all of this possible. The fight had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had faced corruption, harassment, and intimidation, but by combining engineering skill, historical knowledge, and legal strategy, he had protected what mattered most. Jake knew the lake, the bridge, and the community would continue to face challenges, but they were stronger now, united by experience, law, and history. Lasting lessons. The story of Jake Morrison became a lesson for generations. Knowledge is power. Understanding history, law, and technical details can empower individuals to resist injustice. Strategy beats intimidation. Tom Calculated moves are more effective than reactionary anger. Legacy matters. Preserving family and community history requires courage, patience, and foresight. Community strength. True victory comes not from defeating others, but from uniting people around fairness and transparency. The Morrison Bridge stood tall, not just as stone and mortar, but as a testament to integrity, courage, and the enduring power of knowledge.